The Egg and I, Part 2, November, begins with a quote from Hood that reads, "No sun, no moon, no morn, no noon, no dawn, no dusk, no proper time of day, no warmth, no cheerfulness, no healthful ease, no road, no street, no t'other side the way. No comfortable feel in any member, no shade, no shine, no butterflies, no bees, no fruits, no flowers, no leaves, no birds, November." Chapter 4, The Vanquished. Despite its location, I never had the feeling that our small ranch was nestled on the protective lamp of the Olympic Mountains. There was nothing protective about them. Each time I looked out of a window or stepped out of doors, I was confronted by great, white, haughty peaks staring just above my head and doing their chilly best to make me realize that that was once a very grand neighborhood, and it was curdling their blood to have to accept, quote, trade, unquote. We were there with our ugly little buildings and livestock, but, by God, they didn't have to associate with us or make us welcome. They, no doubt, would have given half their timber if they could have changed the locale to Switzerland and brushed us off with a nice big avalanche. All that first spring and summer, they were obviously hostile but passive. With the coming of September, they pulled mist down over their heads like Ku Klux hoods and began giving us the old water cure. It rained and rained and rained and rained. It drizzled, misted, drooled, spat, poured, and just plain rained. Some mornings were black and wild, with a storm raging in and out and around the mountains. Rain was driven under the doors and down the chimney, and Bob went to the chicken house, swathed in oilskins, like a Newfoundland fisherman, and I huddled by the stove and brooded about inside toilets. Other days were just gray and low, hanging with a continual pit-pat, pit-pat, pitta-patta, pitta-patta, which became as vexing as listening to a baby talk. Along about November, I began to forget when it hadn't been raining and became as one with all the characters in all of the novels about rainy seasons who rush around banging their heads against the walls, drinking water glasses of straight whiskey and moaning, "The rain! The rain! My God, the rain!" In case you are wondering why I didn't take a good look, settle down by the stove, and shut up, I would like to explain that Stove, as we called him, had none of the warm, friendly qualities ordinarily associated with the name. In the first place, he was too old, and, like some terrible old man, he had a big, strong frame, a lusty appetite, and no spirit of cooperation. All attempts to get Stove to crackle and glow were as futile as trying to get the Rock of Gibraltar to giggle and cavort. I split pure pitch as fine as horsehair and stuffed his ponderous belly full, but there was no sound and no heat. Yet when I took off the lids, the kindling had burned, and only a few warm ashes remained. It was as mysterious as the girl in high school who ate enormous lunches without apparently chewing or swallowing. Incongruously, things did boil on Stove. This always came as a delightful shock, albeit I finally stopped rushing to the back door and shouting hysterically to Bob, quietly and competently at work, "The water is boiling!" as I had done for the first few hundred times I had witnessed this miracle. I put my first cake into the oven with such a sense of finality that I almost added a "Rest in Peace" wreath, and I felt like Sarah Crew when I came in from the chicken house and the air was vibrant with the warm spicy smell of baking. On the oldest, dreariest morning, Stove sulked all over his head of the kitchen. He smoked and choked and gagged. He ate load after load of my precious live bark, and by noon I could have sat cross-legged on him and read Pilgrim's Progress from cover to cover in perfect comfort. Stove was actually a sinister presence, and he was tricky. The day we first looked at the place, I remarked that he seemed rather defiantly backed up against the wall, but such an attitude could come from neglect, I thought. And so when we moved in, the first thing I did was to clean his suit, take all the rust off his coat and vest, blacken every inch of him except his nickel, which I polished brightly, and then I built my first fire, which promptly went out. I built that fire 5 times, and then Bob came in and poured about a gallon of kerosene on top of the kindling, and Stove began balefully to burn a little. I learned by experience that it took 2 cups of kerosene to get his blood circulating in the morning, and that he would only digest bark at night. In the summer and spring, I didn't care how slow he was or how little heat he gave out. Bob and I were outdoors from dawn to dark, and we allowed plenty of time for cooking things, and all of the wood was dry, and the doors were open, and there was plenty of drought. But with the first rainy day, I realized that Stove was my enemy and would require the utmost in shrewd, cautious handling. From the first rain until the late spring, across the kitchen, in true backwards fashion, we strung lines and lines of washing, only slightly less damp than when first hung up days and sometimes weeks ago. Those things directly over Stove flapped wetly against me as I cooked, but I dared not take them down, for they were the necessary things, like underwear and socks, which had to get dry before summer. Try turning the chops and stirring the tomatoes with someone slapping you across the back of the neck with a wet dish towel. You'll get the idea. I was cold all winter. It seemed that I moved around inside of, but without direct contact with, my clothes, and my skin became so damply chill that, put side by side with a lot of clams, I would have found them cozy. Another factor was that being so cold kept me running to the outhouse, and each trip made me colder, and the next trip frequenter. I wonder if Death Valley Pete wouldn't like a partner. Our spring and summer had been strenuous to the point of exhaustion, and I, at least, having read many books about farms and farmers, had looked forward to winter as a sort of hibernation period, a time to repair machinery, hook rugs, patch quilts, mend harness, and perform other leisurely tasks. Obviously, something was wrong with my planning, for it took me 16 hours a day to keep the stove going and 3 meals cooked. I leaped out of bed at 4 a.m., took 2 sips of coffee, and it was 11 and time for lunch. I washed the lunch dishes and pulled a dead leaf off my kitchen geranium, and it was 5 o'clock in time for dinner. Everyone else in the mountains had dinner at 11 in the morning and supper at 5 in the evening. But dinner at night was, to me, the last remnant of my old civilized life, and I clung to it like a southern girl to her accent. Even though we had it at 5 instead of 7:30, and it was as leisurely as choking down a hot dog at a football game, and our conversation consisted chiefly of, "Pass the pickles," it was dinner at night. Another misconception of farm life I had gleaned from books was that winter was a time of neighborliness. In spring and summer, we were too tired at the end of the day to do anything but fall into bed. But I imagined that winter evenings would be filled with neighborly gatherings, popping corn, drinking hot coffee, talking politics and crops. How wrong I was. Winter was a time for ordinary chores, which took 10 times as long to perform because everything was cold and wet and dark, and the neighboring farmer's one idea was to get the damn things done so he could go in where it was warm and stay put. Farmer's wife followed the same patterns for winter working that I did, which occupied her for 12 to 18 hours a day, and was roughly as follows. Monday, wash day. Washing was something that the mountain farm women had contests doing to see who could get it online first Monday morning, all except me. I had a contest with myself to see how long I could put off doing it all. I attacked my washing with the same sense of futility I would have had in attempting to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. Bob had been a Marine in World War I, and instead of being shell-shocked, he carried home a fixation that a helmet full of water was enough to wash anything, including blankets. And on Monday morning, he would say cheerfully at breakfast, "Going to wash today?" And I would answer hopefully, "Yes, and it's going to be a huge, enormous washing." And so Bob would go whistling down through the orchard to the spring and bring back about 4 tablespoonfuls in the bottom of each bucket, and then disappear into the woods where he remained incommunicado until lunch. A few times I left the washing until after lunch, but learned that sufficiency of water does not compensate for having to straddle clothes, baskets, and washboards while cooking dinner or having to leave the warm house and hang out wet clothes in the dark. So I carried 99% of my wash water, and if I was able to get it hot and could scrub the clothes clean, they never dried in winter. So what? Also, the water was so hard, it should have been chipped out of the spring, and even when mixed 40-60 with soap produced nothing but greasy scum. After a day spent scrubbing clothes in that liquid mineral, I can peel the skin off my hands like gloves. I entered all the soap contents in the vain hope that I would win $5,000 and never have to use theirs or any other washing powder again as long as I lived. I failed to understand why farm wives were always talking about the sense of accomplishment they derive from doing a large washing. I would have had a lot more feeling of accomplishment lying in bed while someone else did the washing. Tuesday, ironing. Ironing with sad irons has nothing at all to do with preconceived ideas about ironing. It is a process by where you grab a little portable handle and run over to the stove and plug it into an iron which is always covered with black. Then you run back to the ironing board and get black on your clean pillowcase. You take the iron over to the sink and wipe it off, and it is, of course, too cool by now to do any good to the dirty pillowcase, so you put it back on the stove and repeat the process until your husband comes in and wants to know where the hell is his lunch. Bob was irritatingly casual about my washing and ironing and was continually putting on clean clothes when he could get them away from me. I got to be just like a dog with a bone over anything I had washed and ironed. It wasn't that I wanted him to act like the advertisements and come dancing into the kitchen in his underwear, clutching a clean shirt and yelling, "No tattletale grid this week, little soft hands." It was just that I wanted him to be conscious of the fact that it took a terrific amount of backbreaking labor to keep us in clean clothes and occasionally to comment on it. "Heaven knows," I would say in exasperation, "you expect and get praise for your work, acting like you delivered every egg with high forceps." I was that way on winter Mondays and Tuesdays. It all seemed so futile. Wednesday, baking day. Each Wednesday plunged me headlong into another great losing battle with bread baking. When I first saw that fanatically happy look light up Bob's face when he spoke of chickens and realized that this was his great love, I made up my mind that I would become, in record time, a model farm wife, a veritable one-man production line somewhere between a Grant Wood painting, an Old Dutch cleanser advertisement, and Mrs. Lincoln's cookbook. Bread was my first defeat, and I lowered my standard by a notch. By the end of the first winter, in view of my long record of notable failures, I would probably have had to retrieve this standard with a post-hole digger. To begin with, the good sport, so the mountain legend has it, made her own yeast by grinding up potatoes, using 1 dry yeast cake per marriage. Keep the yeast alive by adding potato water and never allowing the yeast bowl to get cool. I had been on the farm a matter of seconds before I saw that the only way I can keep anything consistently warm would be to stuff it in front of my dress, so I gave up the homemade yeast idea and resorted to deceit and fresh, quote, store-bought, end quote, yeast. My first batch of bread was pale yellow and tasted like something we had cleaned out of the cooler. I tried again. This batch had the damp elasticity of the English muffin that tasted like something we had intended to clean out of the cooler, but was too heavy. At Bob's gentle but firm insistence, I took a loaf, still quivering from the womb, to a neighbor for diagnosis. Unfortunately, the neighbor, Mrs. Kettle, was just whipping out of the oven 14 of the biggest, crustiest, lightest loaves of bread I had ever seen. I put my little undernourished lump down on the table, and it looked so pitiful among all those great bouncing, well-tanned beauties that I had to control a strong desire to jerk it up, nestle it against me protectively, and run the 4 miles home. Mrs. Kettle had 15 children and baked 14 loaves of bread, 12 pans of rolls, and 2 coffee cakes every other day. She was a very kind neighbor, a long-suffering wife and mother and a hard worker, but she was earthy and to the point. She picked my stillborn loaf from the table, ripped it open, smelled it, made a terrible face, and tossed it out the back door to her pack of mangy, ever-hungry mongrels. "Goddamn stuff stinks," she said companionably, wiping her hands on her large, dirty front. She moved the gallon-sized gray granite coffee pot to the front of the stove, went into the pantry for the cups, and called out to me, "My Hinckley had trouble with her bread, too, when she lived on your place." I brightened, thinking it might be the climate up there on the mountains. But Mrs. Kettle continued, "My Hinckley set her bread at night, and the sponge was fine, and I couldn't put my finger on her trouble till the other day. I went up there, and then I seen what it was. She'd knead up her bread, building a roaring fire, and then go out and lay up with the hired man. When she got back to the kitchen, the bread was too hot. The yeast was dead. Your yeast was dead too," she added. Having quite obviously been given the glove, I hurriedly explained that we had no hired man, and the barn was now a chicken house. Mrs. Kettle heaved a sigh for all good things past and poured our coffee. With the coffee she served hot cinnamon rolls, raspberry jam, and detailed accounts of the moral lapses of the whole country. It was almost noon when I left for home, clutching a loaf of Mrs. Kettle's bread, 2 pocketfuls of anecdotes for Bob, and a few hazy instructions for myself. On the long walk home, I attempted to strain my baking formula from the welter of folklore, but from that day forward, my wooden bread bowl was to me a sort of phallic symbol, and as I kneaded and rolled the unwilling dough, I mulled over the little unconventionalities of my neighbors and wandered through which window the hired man used to beckon to Ma Hinckley. Mrs. Kettle told me that I didn't work fast enough, that store-bought yeast should never be set the night before, and the bread had to be made quickly in one morning. I worked like a frenzied maniac, and I baked 3 loaves of bread twice a week, and it made the house smell peasantry. And in my letters home, I referred very often to my homemade bread, but Bob's reaction, standard, was the true criterion of my success. He said only, "Will it cut?" Tuesday and Wednesday were also optional bath days. Saturday was a must bath day, but because of fires all day for ironing and baking, we also took baths on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. This cutting down from daily bathing to a maximum of 2 complete baths a week wasn't at all hard for me, nor for anyone else who has ever taken a bath in a wash tub. Washtub baths are from the same painful era which housed abdominal operations without anesthetics, sulfur, and molasses in the spring, and high infant mortality. Both Bob and I are tall. He 6 feet 2 inches, and even with conditions right, stove going, the water warm and scented, towels large and dry, always large and slightly damp in winter, the fact remains that the only adult capable of taking a bath in a wash tub in comfort is a pygmy. A sponge bath in the sink was no sensual orgy either, but it was quicker and got off some of the dirt. Thursday was scrub day. Window washing, table leg washing, woodwork washing, cupboard cleaning in addition to the regular floor scrubbing. I indulged somewhat unwillingly in all of these because Bob, whom I accused of having been sired by a vacuum cleaner, was of that delightful old school of husbands who lift up the mattress to see if the little woman has dusted the springs. I didn't dare write this to Gammy. She would have demanded that I get an immediate divorce. I didn't really object too strenuously to Bob's standards of cleanliness as he set them for himself as well, and you can drop a piece of bread and butter on his premises, except the chicken houses, and I defy you to tell which side had been face down. There was just one little task which brought violent discord into our happy home: floor scrubbing. By the end of that first winter, I vowed that my next house would have dirt floors covered with sand. In the first place, Bob had chosen and laid with great precision and care white pine floors. Another type of floor, which might possibly get as dirty as white pine or more quickly, would be one of white velvet. Bob was very thoughtful about wiping his feet, but he might as well have hiked right through the manure pile and on into the kitchen. I scrubbed the floors daily with everything but my toothbrush, yet they always looked as if we had been butchering in the house for the past 4 years. Advice from neighbors had been to use lye, but as many of these lye prescribers were missing an eye or portion of cheek, which tiny scratch they laughingly said they got from falling in or over the lye bucket, I filed lye away as a last resort. I heartily resented having to scrub my floors every day. I thought it a waste of valuable time and energy and accomplished nothing for posterity. I didn't see why, beginning with the rainy season, we didn't just let the floors go or cover them with cheap linoleum. But no, Mountain Farm tradition and Bob's vacuum cleaner heritage had it that I should scrub the floors every day. It was a badge of fine housekeeping, a labor of love, and a woman's duty to her husband. The more I was shown of that side of the life of a farmer's good wife, the more I saw in the life of an old-fashioned mistress. Just don't let anyone tempt me on a linoleum floor, I would growl balefully at Bob. Friday, clean lamps and lamp chimneys. I've heard a number of inexperienced romantics say that they prefer candle and lamplight, that they purposely didn't have electricity put into their summer houses, that archly candle and lamplight make women look beautiful. Personally, I despise lamp and candlelight. My idea of heaven would have been a 10 million watt globe hung from a cord in the middle of my kitchen. I wouldn't have cared if it made me look like something helped from her coffin. I could see then, and candles could go back to birthday cakes, and jack-o'-lanterns and lamps to the attic. In the first place, you need a set of precision instruments and a hair level to trim a lamp wick. Even when it burns straight across for only a moment, then flares up in one quarter and blackens the chimney, it's a draw whether you want to use half your light one way or the other. either with the wick turned up and one side of the chimney black, or the wick turned below the light line. According to Sears Roebuck, the finest kerosene lamp made only gives off about 40 watts of light, so you're a dead cinch to go blind anyway, according to Mazda. Candle and lamplight are supposed to make your eyelashes look long and sweeping. What eyelashes? Most of the time, my eyelids were as hairless as marbles from bending over the lamps to see why in hell those clouds of black smoke. Saturday, market day. In winter, Bob left for, quote, town, end quote, while it was still dark, to sell the eggs, buy feed and groceries, get the mail, cigarettes, and some new magazines. In spring and summer, I joyfully accompanied him, but in the winter, driving for miles and miles in a Ford truck in the rain was not a thing of pure joy, and anyway, in view of the many ordinary delays, such as flat tires, broken springs, plugged gas liners, ad infinitum, I had to stay home to put the lights in the chicken house at the first sign of dusk. Some Saturday mornings, as soon as the mountains had blotted up the last cheerful sound of Bob in the truck, I, feeling like a cross between a boll weevil and a slut, took a large cup of hot coffee, a hot water bottle, a cigarette, and a magazine, and went back to bed. Then from 6:30 until 9 or so, I luxuriated in breaking the old mountain tradition that a decent woman is in bed only between the hours of 7 p.m. and 4 a.m., unless she is in labor or dead. Along about 3:30 or 4 o'clock on Saturday, I had to light the gasoline lanterns, the most frightening task on earth, and contrary to all of my early teachings, that anyone who monkeys around gasoline with matches is just asking for trouble. I never understood why or how a gasoline lantern works, and I always lit the match with the conviction that I should have first sent for the priest. Bob patiently explained the entire confusing process again and again. But to me it was on the same plane with the Hindu rope trick, and it was only when he was not home that I would tolerate the infernal machines in the same room with me. I used to take them out into the rain to pump them up. Then crouching behind the woodshed door, I reached way out and lit them. Immediately, and for several terrible minutes, they flared up and acted exactly as if they were going to explode. Then as suddenly settled back on their haunches to hiss contentedly and give out candle power after candle power of bright white light. With 2 lanterns in each hand, I walked through the complete dejection of last summer's garden, ignoring the pitiful clawings and scratchings of the derelicts of corn stalks and tomato vines, shivering in the rain, and hung the lanterns in the great chicken house, which instantly seemed as gay and friendly as a cocktail lounge. When the frightened squawks of a few hysterical younger hens had died down, I stood and let some of my loneliness drip off in the busy communal atmosphere. The floor was covered with about 4 inches of clean, dry straw, and the hens sang and scratched and made little dust baths and pecked each other and jumped on the hoppers and ate mash and sounded as if they were going to, and did, lay eggs. They were as happy and carefree in November when the whole outside world was beaten into submission by the brooding mountains and the endless rain, as they were on a warm spring day. Then I gathered the eggs. Gathering eggs would be like one continual Easter morning if the hens would just be obliging and get off the nest. Cooperation, however, is not a chickenly characteristic, and so at egg gathering time every nest was overflowing with hen feet planted, and a shoot if you must this old gray head look in her eye. I made all manner of futile attempts to dislodge her. Sharp sticks, flapping apron, loud scary noises, lure of mesh and grain. But she would merely set her mouth, clutch her eggs under her, and dare me. In a way, I can't blame the hen. After all, soft-shelled or not, they're her kids. The rooster now is something else again. He doesn't give a damn if you take every egg in the place and play handball. He doesn't care if the chicken house is knee-deep in weasels and blood. He just flicks a speck from his lapel and continues to stroll around, stepping daintily over the lifeless but still warm body of a former mistress, his lustful eye appraising the leg and breast of another conquest. Bob used to say that it was my approach to egg gathering which was wrong. I reached timidly under the hens, and of course they pecked my wrists. And as I jerked my hands away, I broke the eggs or cracked them on the edges of the nests. Bob reached masterfully under the hens, and they gave without a murmur. I tried to assume this I am the master attitude, but I never for a moment fooled a hen, and after 3 or 4 pecks, I would be a bundle of chittering hysteria with the hens in complete command. Bob usually got home from town around 5, and nothing ever again in all my life will give me ecstatic sensation as he did the first sound of his returning truck. Every few seconds I dashed to the windows to note the progress of the lights, and then finally in he came, smelling deliciously of tobacco, coldness, and outdoors, and with his arms laden with mail, newspapers, magazines, cigarettes, candy, and groceries. How we reveled in those Saturday nights, smoking, eating, reading aloud, and talking, unless perhaps, as sometimes happened, I had forgot to order kerosene. Then I squeezed the can and poured all of the lamps together and turned way up the wick of the one lamp with the scant cup of kerosene in it. But the effect of the pale, scant-wadded light, the sweating walls, and Bob's set mouth and hurt eyes was more than a little as if we were trapped in an old mine shaft. Stove loved situations like that and added to the general discomfort by quickly turning black whenever I lifted his lids, then taking advantage of the murky gloom, he would put out his oven door and gouge me in the shins. Bob was never one to scold, but he showed his disappointment in me by leaving the table, still chewing his last bite, and thrusting himself into bed to dream, no doubt, of the good old days of wife-beating. Sunday. In the country, Sunday is the day on which you do exactly as much work as you do on other days, but feel guilty all of the time you are doing it because Sunday is a day of rest. Sunday mornings I cleaned Stove's suit, taking all of the spots off his vest and coat, and it evidently pleased him, for the stewed chickens and roasted meat and even exuded a little warmth. Excited by his compatibility, I would mull over recipes for popovers, cupcakes, and other hot oven delicacies, but would eventually slink back to deep apple pie, as I could use automatic biscuit mix for the crust, and our apples were delicious, no matter what I did to them. Also, because of Stove's Sunday attitude, I washed my hair on that day and, guided by the pictures in Saturday's magazines, would try the latest hairdos. Unfortunately, my hair is heavy and unmanageable, and my attempts at a pompadour usually ended up looking like a tam o' shanter, suspended over one eye. It made little difference, though, except as a diversion for me, because presently Bob would come in from the chicken house and look hurt, and I would put my hair back the old way. I believe that Bob's mother must have been frightened by a candy box cover while she was carrying him, because he wanted me to wear long hair done in a knot, the color blue, and leghorn hats all of the time. By 1 o'clock on winter Sundays, the house was shining clean. My hair was washed, Bob had on clean clothes, and dinner was ready. Usually, just as we sat down to the table, as if by prearranged signal, the sun came out. True, it shone with about us much warmth and lust, as a Victorian spinster and kept darting behind clouds as if it were looking for its knitting and sticking its head out again with an unapologetic smile. But it was sun and not rain. The mountains, either in recognition of the sun or Sunday, would have their great white busts exposed, and I expected momentarily to have them clear their throats and start singing Rock of Ages in throaty contraltos. For the few minutes on Sunday when I was not within actual striking distance of stove or the sink, I was wiping up the mud I had tracked in from the woodshed. Bob would be occupied for 2 full shifts just chopping wood and carrying water. After dinner we would indulge ourselves by grating and packing eggs. Winter day succeeded winter day, and winter week succeeded winter week, and the only thing that varied was the weather. No wonder the old-timers looked so placid. They didn't have a damn thing to mull over. The days slipped down like junket, leaving no taste on the tongue.